Hello, art historians, and welcome to our lecture over Greek architecture. Now, what I want to remind you of is when we last talked about Greek art, we talked about this obsession with perfection that really started to establish during the classical period. And the art and architecture that we see really follows that belief system of humanism that the Greeks held so dear to them. So remember, in this classical period that we're going to talk about, no matter what culture it's in, we talk about these belief systems and ideas that aren't necessarily all religions. And to the Greeks, their big belief system was humanism. And with humanism came rationalism, that things could be explained without religion or without belief. And this idea that humans were just as awesome as the gods were. So if they were going to be that, then humans should strive as much as possible for perfection in everything. So everything that they saw around them should be a reflection of that idea and also a reminder of how perfect they can be. And so we kind of looked at that with Doryphorus or the spear bearer, which we know, of course, is actually too perfect to be physically possible. So this idea of humanism and rationality and that everything can be explained perfectly and balanced and orderly is going to be not only represented in the art and sculpture that they created, but also in the architecture. And we can probably see this best with the Parthenon. Now, one thing I want you guys to really take away from this is the Parthenon is a building, but it's part of a much bigger complex. And that is a huge part of this. Like the Parthenon itself was designed to be a critical part and like the centerpiece of this massive complex on top of the Acropolis. So the Acropolis in Greek, and a lot of the city-states had this. So acro and polis. Polis means city. So if you've ever heard of like metropolis, it means city. And acro meaning high, like acrobats perform high in the air. So a lot of these Greek city-states, because they had a lot of mountains and hills, they would actually put the most important parts of their city, like the religious buildings and the government buildings, sitting on top of the Acropolis because it was very easy to defend. It was kind of a rallying point if people were being attacked. So what's going to happen is that after the Persian War, during the battle of the one that we know with Sparta, so the battle for the 300 that we know of, the Battle of Thermopylae, which is the second battle of the Persian Wars, we know that even though the Spartans held tight and tried to protect Athens as long as they could, and even though most of Athens escaped, Persia will eventually break through and completely destroy Athens and the Parthenon. It was kind of a symbol that they had defeated them and they were going to take down what was most important to them. And they were also taking down the temple of Athena. So Athena being their patron goddess of Athens, which she's also the goddess of wisdom. So that makes a lot of sense. So after the Persian War is over, Pericles, who's kind of like this major statesman who kind of establishes what real democracy is going to look like in Athens, says we need to rebuild the Parthenon and we need to rebuild the complex and show the victory of Athena over the Persians. But at the same time, that's not really the Greek way. It's not really about celebrating the gods. So in a really passive aggressive way, this complex celebrates Athena, but it actually celebrates humans more, the humans who built it, and showing how awesomely perfect it is for Athena, of course, and also showing the things in kind of a symbolic way that the people were the ones who won the Persian War and not necessarily Athena. But of course, Athena is important to them, so they're going to have a temple for her. But in a really weird way, the perfection of this for Athena is really more to show off the perfection of the Greeks and their ability to build a perfect building for Athena, of course. So what we know about this is it was such an amazing building that it was designed by men who eventually literally wrote the books on their philosophies regarding how architecture should go. And basically these books reflected the idea of humanism in architecture, that it can be perfect and balanced and rational and make perfect sense through the use of things like geometry and orders, architectural orders. So we've seen, if you've done the activity, you know that we have these three orders. We have Doric, which is much more masculine. We have Ionic, which is much more feminine. And then we have Corinthian, which is much more elaborate and really only used later on. So think about, we call them the orders, like it's bringing order. There was a choice, and no matter what order you chose, if you chose Ionic, then there were set things that you could and could not do in designing that building. So we see here, we know who the sculptor is, and that's Phidias, who is known as the greatest sculptor in the world. Ictinos and Callicrates are the architects of this building. Phidias is in charge of the sculpture. And these guys, because of their work on this, wrote the books. And like I said, their ideas on architecture basically reflected the ideas of humanism. So everything about the Parthenon and the entire complex is a visual representative of what the Greeks were celebrating and how they felt about themselves, especially after beating the Persians. I mean, this was a huge deal. So you can actually go visit this today. A lot of my students have gone and visited the Acropolis and actually walked up the ceremonial pathway, because below, okay, so this is the Acropolis sitting up high on the hill, and below this, down here at the bottom, would be the Athenian Agora. So the Agora was open to all people. It was kind of a marketplace where all roads in Greece led to the Agora, and it's where like their major government buildings were, because those should be accessible to everyone. But that was where the common people were. The gods were up above them visibly. So like the temples and everything would be up there. And they would have this great ceremony every year for Athena. And they would start from the bottom and they would walk up this entire processional and go up and do these great ceremonies to honor Athena, but at the same time also honoring themselves as humans. So right here you can see this the entire complex. All right, so you see right here, this is called the propylae. As you can see down here at the bottom, this propylae is that ceremonial walkway that links to the agora at the bottom. And you would walk up to this, and basically it looked like you were deliberately rising up into the sky. So it's kind of the same idea as the Temple of Amun-Ra in Karnak for the Egyptians, because that was supposed to be the place that rose up from the Nile and like rose out, like humanity basically became out of it. So as you walked up, you got higher. So almost like you're rising up out of the waters, and then around you are those columns that look like papyrus. So like basically you're seeing the reeds on the Nile. So this is kind of that same idea as you are walking up this, and you can only kind of see up, you're kind of ascending up into the heavens, so into this godly realm. And you can see here, there's the Temple of Athena Nike right here, this little tiny one, which protects and watches over the people coming up here. And what's ironic is that is the temple that's truly dedicated to Athena's victory. But even though you think that would be the Parthenon up here at the top, it's actually not, because the Parthenon really and truly honors the people who built the building and the people who won the war, much more so than it honors Athena herself. So this is the propylae. It's that very ornate entryway. And like I said, you're coming up this very, very steep, this whole thing was planned to be an experience. All right, so you're coming through this processional, and they called it the Pan-Athenic Festival. So pan, like everybody all around the world, all these people, Athena, Pan-Athenic, it's all about this festival for her. So you're coming up through these gates where you're kind of blocked up and can't see everything, and then you're coming up these steps where it's so steep you can't see up at the top, and then you come up to this beautiful Doric temple entryway, which models and mirrors what you're going to see at the Parthenon. So these two kind of mirror each other, but kind of making you feel like you're entering into this realm of the gods as you are approaching it. So the whole idea, and again, the Greeks are not about the individual, it's all about every part creates this beautiful whole all together. So this is, you come up the propylae, you see these massive Doric columns, which if you think about it, Doric is more manly, right? It's more plain, it's more strong, it's more imposing. And if this is supposed to be about Athena, it should probably be more Ionic, but only if you look up here at the top, that's the Temple of Athena Nike, which is very girly and is very, Ionic in its design. It's got the little swirls up at the capitals, but it's not on the entryway, nor is it to the Parthenon itself, which is probably a way of saying, like, this is actually more about the men who won the war, and Athena may have helped make that possible, but it's supposed to be about a male victory. So again, this whole thing is united under this idea of Athena and this experience of once you came up that propylae, you were entering in to another realm, like basically into a godly realm. So you can see here, this is a really good view of coming up the steps, that you can't really see anything at the top until you get to the top. And then it's like you're almost up in the sky where the gods reside. You're in kind of like this heavenly realm. And you can see these very Doric columns that still remain. And with the Doric order came the triglyphs up here at the top. So you can definitely see those triglyphs. And then in between the spaces would be metopes where you could put sculpture, but that was all part of the order that made it look balanced. So here's the front of the Parthenon. And from looking at this, remember, this was supposed to be the most perfect building ever created. It was all about mathematics and geometric ratios and x equals 2y in terms of how the columns are. So you can see here that if you're looking very closely, the columns are not perfectly straight up and down. They actually bulge a little bit, which actually, if you're viewing that from the front, makes them look all the same size. And the ones in the middle get fatter, right? While the ones on the outside are slimmer, because it's an optical illusion of working with the eye. You can also see that just barely this building, so right here we have the pediment, which is the triangular structure right here. The pediment and the entablature right here, which is the part that the pediment or triangle sits on, almost kind of slopes upward a little bit to draw your eye upwards, because if you didn't, it would just look very heavy and squatting. So it almost looks like it's floating a little bit. And then what you also don't notice is that the columns actually curve just a little bit, because our eye curves, and they knew that. So by making the columns curve just ever so slightly, our eye sees them as a perfect straight line. So it's so perfect, it's not even possible to achieve that level of perfection without some imperfections. So the Parthenon was built to hold this massive cult statue of Athena. And if you've ever watched Hercules, which you should because you'll feel brilliant after you watch it, I promise you, you saw that Hercules went and visited this big temple for his father Zeus, and inside was this massive statue of Zeus. And that was called the cult statue. And Athena had one inside, made of gold and ivory. And actually there's a replica of this in Memphis, Tennessee that you can go visit and see what it would have looked like. But what's crazy about this is it looks like it's perfectly straight and perfectly balanced. But in the Parthenon, there are 0 straight lines that actually exist in it, because that wouldn't have worked. Our eye wouldn't have seen it as perfect if we didn't make it imperfect. So what we're seeing is, it's called entasis, which is a swelling of the columns, and now it's pointed out, you can see that some of them are a little bit fatter, but these columns were actually a metaphor, because these are supposed to represent, because they were perfect, this humanistic idea of support, that really Athena may have been there, but it was the humans who are really supporting Athens and who did this. So again, the entablature right here, which is this entire upper part where the pediment would have been, curves upwards, which actually draws your eye higher up. Now, what's crazy about this is, so you had the exterior, so you would walk up the steps and you would walk past this first row of columns, and then you would go to the interior of the building, where once you went on the inside, they had the cult statue of Athena, but then there was an Ionic frieze on the inside. Now, a frieze is a band of sculpture, right, that almost looks like a scene that just, you went freeze and like it froze, almost like a movie reel. It just went freeze, except it's not separated into like film sections. It's all one thing. So in Ionic order, you could have that. And on the inside of this, it is Ionic and a little bit more girly. It's almost like hiding that a little bit for Athena, but on the outside is much stronger and much more masculine. So is this really for Athena, or is it really for the men who created it, designed it, and won the Persian War? So this is what it would have looked like, and then there would have been this pool of water for tranquility on the inside, so kind of like quiet reflection. So this is what the interior would look like, and you can see everything that's round is actually a column, okay? So pay attention, because this is kind of important, all right? So the metopes, so if you look on the Doric order, you have the triglyphs, which are the 3 little lines, okay? And then in between it, you would have sculpture called metopes, okay? So when you would walk up to the Parthenon, it was just like the white ziggurat in its temple, that you could not just walk right in. It was designed to make you walk all the way around the outside of it. Okay, so on the outside, exterior, so like on the outside, so like here's that first row of columns right here. Okay, on that entablature, so up at the top, you would see these stories like the sacking of Troy, and you would see these things that have to do with like human achievement in war. Okay, then you have on these directions, so on the eastern side where things begin, you have in the pediment, okay, in the pediment sculpture, so you have the birth of Athena. All right, so the birth of Athena is happening, so it's the beginning of Athens on the east. All right, but then you have facing towards the west, you have this scene of Athena and Poseidon who are battling each other. And Poseidon is the god of war, and Athena is the goddess who won, or excuse me, Poseidon's the god of water. Athena is the goddess who defeated him. So what we're seeing here is this parallel of Athena defeating Poseidon on the water. So what it really is a metaphor for, even though it looks like it's celebrating Athena, is it's actually passively aggressively talking about Athens defeating Persia on the water in their very last battle. So it's supposed to be about Athena, but really it's kind of more about what humans did in just kind of a metaphor kind of way. All right, so then once you would walk past, okay, so you're standing outside the columns, you're looking up at the building, you're seeing these great scenes of things that the gods have done and these heroes have done, and then you walk through the columns and you're facing a wall. Okay, because inside of that would be where the sculpture is of Athena. And most people, just like at the Temple of Karnak, wouldn't get to go on the inside except on special occasions. But you still want the people to feel like they're part of Athens and they're part of this. So what you see on here is called the Panathenaic procession. All right, and what that is this ceremony where they would start at the agora at the bottom, and they would, during this festival to celebrate Athena, bring her a new peplos or robe that the women would sew and then bring it up and do this. So this is actually showing that ceremony, but here's what's incredible about it. This is one of the first times in history we'd ever actually seen a sculpture that had nothing to do with military or religion. It had to do with everyday people doing something, granted for a religious purpose. But you could see on this Panathenaic procession, on this frieze, that you could see here are these women that people could walk by this and go, oh my gosh, I did that. Like I was part of that. They could see themselves in this. Okay, so while the inside honors Athena truly, the outside on the pediments facing east and west seem to honor Athena, but they kind of passively aggressively honor the men in Athens who defeated the Persians. Then you walk past the columns and you're staring at a wall, but up at the top of it, you have these scenes from a festival that they could probably participate in, that they've probably seen, and it's very humanistic because it's about the humans honoring Athena. So Phidias, okay, who was the designer of this entire thing, the entire sculptural program of the Parthenon and the Parthenon complex, wanted this to be, when you, from the minute you walked from the agora up to this, that you are looking at a theatrical experience. This was supposed to be something that's experienced, not just looked at. All right. So what this does is it basically brings the heavens and the earths together at this upper spot, because yeah, you're on top of the world, you're in this heavenly domain, but don't forget, humans are as awesome as the gods, and humans are an important part of the world too, because they built this thing. Look how perfect it is. And then you can see scenes like this right here on the Parthenon, where the men are waiting for the, peplos chore to be, or the peplos to be sewn. You see women actually doing the procession and sewing this thing. So it really combines humans and the gods on kind of an equal level, because yes, they have this beautiful temple to Athena, but it's also honoring men and women and the people who are critical in honoring Athena. So the columns, what's really cool about it is, so if you're standing outside the Parthenon and here's the columns, and then you look through the columns and you're looking at this ionic frieze around it, because look, it looks like a scene where it just went freeze and like it froze the action that was going on. The columns help break it up into a narrative so you can see the different parts of this procession for the ceremony of Athena. So what you were meant to do is you would enter from the west of this, because obviously when you enter from the west, you're going to see Athena defeating Poseidon. So the first thing you're going to be remembering is the fact that the Persians were defeated on the water. So then you would kind of get, as you walked around, it's almost cinematic, like a movie, as you're walking around the temple and you're seeing these different scenes of the Panathenaic profession, which they probably were up there because they were participating in it. So it really makes them feel like they're part of this heavenly realm, combining this, heavenly humans and the heavenly world together. So it is this scene of the biggest festival that Greece had. It's including women, but slaves couldn't be a part of it. Now, they would generally do it every year, but the Peplos was every 4 years on Athena's birthday, because these things take a long time to sew. Like, the statue was huge, and there would be 4 little girls, virgins, who would be carrying this Peplos up to Athena to offer it for her. So then you would curve around and you would face the dawn, okay, which is where the east rises, which is the rise of Athena. And then through that, you could see the cult statue of her. Remember, this is meant to be an experience, kind of like if you go to the Science Center and they just had this exhibit on Pompeii. Like, you're meant to be experiencing this in the way that it's designed. So this is the plaque of the Ergostines from that frieze on the wall of the Parthenon that would be on the exterior of it. All right, so this is a piece of that frieze that there probably would have been a column on each side of this to divide up this particular scene. All right, and what they would do with this is they would actually formally make it thicker bas relief up at the top and then thinner at the bottom. So if you're looking up, you can actually see the upper half of this even better. So the Ergostines were in charge of sewing that Peplos for Athena every year. It was a big part of their job. And we're really seeing regular everyday humans who aren't soldiers, who aren't anybody in particular, but who are doing something important for Athena. So this triangular portion of a temple is called a pediment, and you're never going to be able to unsee this, because now every time you see a classically inspired building or house, your brain is going to go, that's a pediment. So just so you know, the pediment right here is this triangle at the top. This entire upper part that sits on the columns are called the entablature. This band right here underneath it is called the architrave, and then you can see the little triglyphs, which are a symbol that this is Doric, especially the manly type of columns. And then in between it, you see the metopes. Okay, so the metopes are these little, statues or sculptures that would be put in between them because it kind of helps tell a story. And they would have been painted. For everybody who thinks that Greek is all about white marble, no, they wouldn't, because the paint actually helped add detail. Now, you'll notice something really kind of crazy about this is the Greeks have moved away from hierarchy of scale. They're like, that's not rational. That's not how human beings actually look. And if we're all about humans, then we need to show it how they actually look. So what the Greeks did is something completely new, because in their pediment sculptures that are on the east and west end of the Parthenon that show Athena's birth down here at the bottom, and then up here at the top, you see her defeating Poseidon. You can see Poseidon's pitchfork up here at the top. You can see that all they did, instead of making one person look taller than the other, they put Athena and Poseidon dead center. So that shows importance. But then everybody else just changes their position to realistically fit in the pediment. So like somebody's laying down, somebody's kneeling, somebody's laying down. So they're humanistically proportionate. They look natural, but they're meant to be changing positions to fit into the pediment instead of having just people get smaller. So these are what we call the Elgin Marbles, and I'll explain that in a second. And the Elgin Marbles were the marble sculptures that were originally on the Parthenon that are no longer in Greece. They're actually located in Britain in the British Museum, which we'll talk about, which is a huge deal. So right here, for example, we have Helios, horses, and Dionysus. So this is actually, you could see, would have fit into that reclining part of the pediment. So that actually made people like change their positions. And this is the three goddesses who are kind of laying down on the other side. Now, Phidias was very, very smart because he's like, okay, I have to show women in this. And if I'm going to show the female human body, because at this point showing female nudity was not yet acceptable, how am I going to do this? So what Phidias is famous for is creating a way to show the female body without showing nudity or shaming Athena. So what he comes up with is called like the wet look, right? So it looks like these women were wearing clothes and he took a bucket of water and threw it on it so that the fabric would cling to them. So you can't see them as nude, but you can still see pretty much everything and see the human body and appreciate the female body. But what you see here is they're still not away from this idealism. Okay, so women were a little bit less important, so showing them realistic is okay. Like that's fine. If their wet clothing is clinging to them and they're not perfect and they're flawed, that's okay, because really it's about Athena's perfection anyway, right? But you can see here on Helios, horses, and Dionysus, the center male, yes, he's in a naturalistic pose, but he's still in that idealistic, perfect body, following those proportions of the spear bearer of, so perfect it's not actually possible. So if you're not catching what's happening here, and I'll bring myself back into this, this is the British Museum. And so what happened is Lord Elgin, who was the British ambassador, actually made a deal with the Ottoman Empire, who was kind of taking over Greece at the time, so that he could take away the marbles from off of the Parthenon. And the Greeks have said that this has never been fair because technically he made a decision with people who were not Greek because the Ottomans were obviously Turkish. And so it was, not really fair that he take them back. And on top of that, adding insult to injury, if you look at the front of the British Museum, it is classical. It's basically a renovation of Greek architecture. So you have the pediment sculpture up there at the top, which basically looks like the Parthenon. It's almost just rubbing their nose in it. Now, granted, this is Ionic columns and not Doric, but inside the British Museum, they have these on display. So they're the Parthenon marbles, but they call them the Elgin Marbles because Lord Elgin is the one who saved them. So again, Athens claims that he basically paid off the Ottoman Sultan, and it wasn't the Sultan's to give away. These were Greek. And Athens wants these back, and Britain says absolutely not, and says we would loan them if you'd recognize that they are ours. And this is not something that's new. Egypt is actually having the exact same problem, that they want a lot of their things back, not just from the British Museum, but they want them back from Boston and New York and Chicago. And they want the things back that they feel have been looted from them, basically. So this is one of the rooms that you can see here where the Elgin Marbles are, and you can see right here the processional frieze, which they're like, you're not telling the entire story. It's out of context. It doesn't make sense where it's located. There's the Doric columns on the side, which kind of look like what you would have seen on the Parthenon. And then you can see some of the pediment sculptures, Helios, horses, and Dionysus, and the three goddesses. You can see that, how they would have fit and how big they would have been in that pediment. There are a lot of protests that take place with the Greeks where they go to the museum and they stage, like, these are women who look like the women in the processional frieze wearing the traditional peplos that would have been worn by Athena and saying, these are ours, bring them back. There are celebrities like George Clooney have stepped up to help out Greece and saying that they should have these back. They have protested at the Olympic Games. They have protested at soccer matches. Like, this is actually still all over Twitter. You can find it. This is at a sporting event, a soccer match, actually, where you can see the Greeks are saying history cannot be stolen, bring the marbles back. So they're still holding this pretty seriously regarding the Elgin Marbles. Now, on the complex of the Parthenon, you also have the Temple of Athena Nike. And this temple, which overlooks the propylae. So it's almost like she's guarding it. Almost like she used to have, if you can see the statue right here, like she used to have wings, all right, that would have counterbalanced her a little bit. And you can see Phidias's wet look, that wet drapery look that's very, Phidias style. So this is a very small Ionic. It would have had a frieze, you can see up here at the top, kind of girly, simple little temple. This one's just for Athena, and it's kind of like, oh, it's cute, kind of demeaning to the woman, actually, whereas the Parthenon was supposed to be for her, but it's actually more for the people who made it, actually. So this was supposed to be like, the propylae was this vulnerable entrance, so she's there overlooking it. The sculptures that are in it that are left are really about Athena's victory. So this is Athena, Temple of Athena Nike. Nike means Athena's victory, right? So that's what Nike actually meant. And really, it's almost celebrates Phidias. Like, this is his masterpiece in showing his mastery of human anatomy, even though still it's supposed to be about Athena. And this is Nike adjusting her sandal inside, Athena's temple, where it's like basically, her victory, that she's celebrating it. And just a fun fact, Athena Nike was usually shown with wings. So here's what's kind of crazy about this, is it looks like she would have had wings, okay? Because typically Nike always had wings on and kind of like landed in this area. but they showed this one wingless. So it's a wingless victory, so that way Athena could never leave Athens and take away their victory and their guardian. So it's almost really bizarre, like kind of like a Maleficent, like cutting her wings off kind of thing. It's awful. All right, so we are going to stop here because then we're going to start getting into late classical. But hopefully this has helped you a little bit with Greek architecture.